Welcome to Chess Forge. If a deadly hidden trap inside the queen's gambit that most white players have never seen sounds like your kind of chess, you are going to love this video. Because today we are doing a complete breakdown of the elephant trap. The elephant trap is a secret weapon buried inside the most famous opening in chess, a stunning pin that punishes white's most natural-looking move. I have spent hours analyzing this, so you do not have to. And I am about to show you every line a serious player needs to know. Let us get started. The Queen's Gambit became famous worldwide through the Netflix series, yet this devastating trap hidden inside it is almost completely unknown at club level. It was first recorded in Farney vs. Alapin, Mannheim 1914, and has been catching white players off guard for over 100 years. Black plays normal, principled developing moves, then springs a trap that lets white capture a queen only to lose a full piece in return. The elephant trap earns its place in every serious player's repertoire because it exploits a specific pattern of natural-looking moves that white almost instinctively wants to make, and punishes that instinct precisely. Let us walk through it move by move. Pawn to d4. White stakes a claim in the center and opens the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. Pawn to d5. Black immediately contests the center on equal terms. Pawn to c4. The Queen's Gambit, white pressures black's center pawn with a flanking challenge, rather than a direct confrontation. Pawn to e6. Black declines the gambit and reinforces the d5 pawn, accepting a slightly passive structure in exchange for solidity. Knight to c3. White develops with tempo and increases pressure on the d5 pawn for the second time. Knight to f6. Black develops toward the center and begins coordinating the kingside pieces toward a future castle. Bishop to g5. This is the move that sets the trap in motion. White pins the f6 knight, which appears to relieve pressure on d5, but actually walks into a carefully prepared sequence. Knight to d7. Black reinforces the d5 pawn a third time while quietly unlocking the battery that makes the elephant trap function. The queen now has a clear path to b6, and the d7 knight is not as passive as it looks. White has three natural continuations here, and the choice between them determines whether this game becomes a comfortable equality or a serious structural problem for one side. Black has laid the groundwork, and now white must step into the position without knowing exactly where the danger lies. Pause the video and decide what you would play here. This opening has been played in over 52,000 games at master level. Now, what happens if white gets greedy? This is the line where white gets greedy and black makes them pay for every pawn they touch. Alright, here we go. Let me show you how it plays out. Pawn takes on d5. White opens the center, which looks completely natural. And that is exactly why so many players fall into what comes next. Pawn takes on d5. Black recaptures to keep the center contested and, critically, to bait the knight forward. Knight takes on d5. This is the fatal decision. White grabs a second pawn, but the knight is now deep in enemy territory with no support. Knight takes on d5, black recaptures the knight, and now the position looks like white is winning a queen. But what happens next is the whole point of this trap. Bishop takes on d8. White takes the queen. On paper this looks like a free queen, a whole queen for just a bishop. But black does not care about the queen. Watch what comes next. Bishop to b4. Check. The bishop comes to b4 with check, and suddenly everything makes sense. White's bishop on d8 is completely undefended, and black is about to win it back along with the queen. Queen to d2. White blocks the check with the queen, the only legal move. But now the queen is right where black wants it. Bishop takes on d2. Bishop takes the queen with check. White has no choice but to recapture. King takes on d2. King takes the bishop. White has spent a queen just to get out of check. King takes on d8. Black recaptures the bishop on d8. The dust settles. Black has won a full piece for nothing. The elephant trap is complete. White is down a full piece with no compensation. White gave up a queen and a bishop just to get a queen and a bishop back, but the critical difference is the knight that black won on move 11. That is the elephant trap. When white plays e3 instead of e4, they sidestep the trap entirely. And you need to know why this changes everything. Let us see exactly how this opening develops. Pawn to e3. White keeps the diagonal closed, refusing to give black the open lines the elephant trap depends on. Pawn to c6. Black reinforces the center and keeps options open, since the main trap is not available. Knight to f3. White develops sensibly and heads toward a solid queen's gambit structure, with no weaknesses to exploit. Queen to a5. Black still tries the pin motif, but without the open e-file it carries far less venom. Bishop takes on f6. White gladly trades bishop for knight because the structural imbalance here simply does not favor black the way it does in the main line. Knight takes on f6. Black recaptures, and the position is roughly equal. No trapped pieces, no material swing, just chess. This line is a dead end for the trap, which is exactly why you have to recognize e3 immediately and shift your thinking to a different plan. In practice, black scores 52% from this position. This slightly favors black. First, let us see what happens when white declines. When white plays knight to f3 and then e3, they are steering away from the main line entirely, and the elephant trap simply has no teeth here. Okay, let us take it from the very first move. Knight to f3. White develops naturally, avoiding the early c4 push that gives the trap its whole context. Pawn to c6. You reinforce d5 and keep the structure solid, staying flexible while waiting to see how white commits. Pawn to e3. White keeps the bishop locked on c1, which removes any pressure on d5 and closes the door on the trap completely. Queen to a5. You can still try queen to a5 to probe the queen side, but without the tactical threat that makes it lethal in the main line, it is just a developing move. Bishop takes on f6. White exchanges to double your pawns and ease any queenside tension before it becomes real. Knight takes on f6. You recapture and the position is equal. A solid but entirely normal game with no trace of the trap. Know this line so you recognize it immediately and stop looking for the trap. It is not there. In practice, black scores 54% from this position. This slightly favors black. Before the main line, what if white sidesteps? When white declines with e3, the game flattens out into solid, equal territory. No tricks, no fireworks. Here we go. Watch closely. Pawn takes on d5. White captures to clarify the central structure before committing pieces. Pawn takes on d5. Black recaptures and the center is now symmetrical. The trap is already off the table. Pawn to e3. White supports the pawn and prepares to develop the light-squared bishop, which is the key difference from the main line where the knight leaped forward instead. Pawn to c6. Black shores up the pawn and stakes out firm control of the center. Bishop to d3. White develops sensibly, pointing the bishop toward the king side without any tactical ambitions. Bishop to e7. Black mirrors that calm development, and both sides are heading toward a standard queen's gambit decline structure, with no imbalances to speak of. Against e3, the trap simply does not exist, which is why understanding this line helps you recognize exactly how much the knight changes everything in the main line. In practice, black scores 58% from this position. This favors black. Within the accepted gambit, white has another try here. White can also trade pawns with c takes d5 after e3, steering into a symmetrical structure that completely avoids the elephant trap's key tension. All right, let us dive in and watch how this unfolds. Pawn to e3. Same solid choice. White keeps the center restrained. Pawn to c6. Black again reinforces the center, waiting to see which direction white commits. Pawn takes on d5. White releases the central tension early, trading away the very pawn structure the elephant trap needs to function. Pawn takes on d5. Black recaptures and now both sides have a symmetrical pawn center with nothing unresolved. Bishop to d3. White develops toward a standard isolated queen's pawn or symmetrical setup. Nothing for black to ambush. Bishop to e7. Black develops quietly because there's no trick available. This is just a normal game now. Once white trades on d5 like this, you are no longer playing the elephant trap. You are playing a different opening altogether, so know when to let it go. In practice, black scores 51% from this position. The position is roughly equal. Here's an alternative white sometimes plays at this point. Bishop to d3 early is white's attempt to develop the bishop before committing to a pawn structure, but it does not change the fundamental dynamics enough to matter. Let us walk through it move by move. Pawn to e3. Still the same cautious choice, keeping the light-squared bishop's diagonal blocked for now. Pawn to c6. Black solidifies the center and waits, since the structure is still fluid. Bishop to d3. White develops the bishop before deciding on a pawn break, but this move order does not diffuse the pin motif. Queen to a5, black immediately goes for the pin anyway, because the bishop does not prevent it. Bishop takes on f6. White tries to resolve the pin by eliminating the pinned piece, but the trade still leaves black with the bishop pair. Knight takes on f6. Black recaptures with the knight and holds a fully equal game with good piece activity ahead. Bishop to d3 before developing the knight changes the move order, not the outcome. Equality is the ceiling here, and that tells you everything about why e3 lines are sidelines rather than main challenges. In practice, black scores 59% from this position. This favors black. This is the elephant trap in a real tournament game. 2002, David Medrano, rated 2261, has just played knight takes d5 and walked straight into the trap. The dust settles. Black has won a full piece. Now watch how Borda converts. All right, here we go. Let me show you how it plays out. Pawn to e4. White pushes for activity, the only plan available with the king exposed. Knight to f6. The knight retreats, staying connected and safe. Bishop to d3. Bishop to d3, developing. Knight to b6. The second knight finds the outpost on b6. Knight to f3. Knight to f3. King to e7. The king walks toward the center. Neither side has castling rights, but black's extra piece makes that completely irrelevant. Rook to e1. Rook to d8. And the rook immediately targets the d-file, the same file where white's king is still standing. Pawn to h3. White makes a quiet move. Pawn to c6. Black solidifies the center. Rook to d1. White doubles on the d-file, trying to create counterplay. King to f8. King reaches safety on f8. King to c1. White tucks the king away on the queen side, but the extra piece is simply too much. Bishop to e6. The bishop comes to life on e6. Bishop to b1. White retreats. Rook to c8. Both rooks are fully mobilized. Knight to h2. Knight repositions. Knight to h5. And the knight begins a march, heading for f4. Rook to f1. White shifts the rook. Bishop to c4. Bishop to c4, lining up on the rook. Rook to e1. White tries to hold everything together. Knight to f4. Knight to f4, dominating, threatening to jump to e2 at any moment. Pawn to g3. White tries to push it back. Knight to e2 check. A fork on the king and the rook. Medrano resigns. The elephant trap delivers. 21 moves, 2 rated players above 2200, and white walked directly into a pattern recorded since 1914. That is the elephant trap. Simple, principled, and lethal. And there you have it, the elephant trap, top to bottom. You know what I love about teaching like this? Watching you all go out and win games with it. So that is your homework. Play it, spring the patterns, and tell me about your wins in the comments. I read every single one. If you want more videos like this, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next one.